Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show for thinking people, where we explode the many modern myths within the matrix and empower you with the information that you need to build the knowledge that you need so that you can thrive. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today, we're going to be busting the myth that whole grains are a healthy food option. And with me to help do this is Dr. William Davis. Dr. William Davis is a cardiologist and a medical doctor from Missouri in the United States, and he is a self-educated expert on the hazards of eating wheat. He has authored the New York Times best-selling book Wheat Belly and its associated books, the Wheat Belly Detox and the Full Health Program, etc. And he's also got a latest book out called Undoctored, but that is beyond the remit for today. Dr. William Davis, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time, and welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Nigel.
Great stuff. Maybe you can kick us off with how you got from being a cardiologist to becoming an expert on the hazards of wheat.
Sure, Nigel. It started with heart disease because that's what I was doing for 25 years. I was the guy who took people to the cardiac catheterization laboratory, the cath lab, and did angioplasty and stents and rotational atherectomy, all those things we do to open arteries when people are either having a heart attack or threatened with a heart attack. Well, my mom died of sudden cardiac death from where I grew up in New Jersey. I was living in Wisconsin at the time. And it drove home to me, not just the loss of my mom, but the loss of my mom to the disease I dealt with morning, noon, and night. And so it really drove home to me, and I kind of knew this before, but it really drove this point home, Nigel. That is that heart disease is not a disease best dealt with in a procedural lab. Many people, like my mom, die before they get to the hospital. So I sought out ways to identify early heart disease. So if you and I are destined for a heart attack in, say, 5 years or 10 years, is there a way to predict that? Well, there was, and there still is, by the way. And this idea is only catching on recently in the UK, partly due to one of my friends, by the way, David Bobbitt in Ireland. But it was a heart scan. We got a device, one of the first several devices in the US. Back then it was called an EBT, or an electron beam tomography device. Very rapid CAT scan, because the heart's a moving object. It had multiple phases of motion. There's lung motion, there's human motion. And we're trying to image something that's essentially millimeters or even fractions of a millimeter. We're trying to image the plaque, the atherosclerosis in the arteries. And this device did it. It gave you a heart scan score. Well, in my town, we did thousands and thousands and thousands of these. And so nice people come to me and say, well, what do I do with my score of 700 or 1,000? Normal is 0, no plaque. Okay. And these are people, these are typically businessmen, engineers, housewives, school teachers who I say, I feel good. I'm 53. My dad had a heart attack at 57. I wouldn't know if I'm at risk. And he comes through. He has a high score. He is indeed at risk. And if you don't do something about it, you die or have a heart attack or develop unstable symptoms sufficient to justify going to the cath lab, bypass operation, stents, that kind of thing. Well, the conventional solution back then, this is now 22 or so years ago, was statin drugs and a low-fat diet and aspirin. So we did that. We helped publish some of the data. Nigel, it does not work. It hardly has any effect at all. You can take all that statin drugs you want. You will have a heart attack more than likely. It has almost no impact whatsoever. Not my speculation. Published data. We help publish those data. Mm-hmm. So what do, Nigel? Have people freaking out on me? Score 700. If you do nothing, meaning take a statin drug, cut your fat, exercise, everything in moderation, that's nothing, by the way. The score goes up 25 to 30% per year. So a score of 700 today is 910 or something like that in a year. Now these people are really freaking out. So they're turning to me. What the hell do we do? Well, my unscrupulous colleagues, there's a lot of dishonesty in medicine in the U.S., Nigel, you may know that, particularly among my colleagues, the cardiologists and the heart disease, because there's so much money in it that a lot of my colleagues, unscrupulous as they were, said, well, Nigel, let's do the real test, a heart catheterization, see if you need preventive bypass or stent implantation. And by the way, that is malpractice when properly scrutinized, but that's what goes on because people are terrified, and it makes a lot of money. So here we are with nothing. And by the way, the consensus opinion back then, 20-some years ago, was by the experts, well, just don't look for the heart disease anymore. Don't scan these people. Let them have a heart attack or develop symptoms, and then deal with it in the cath lab or the ER or whatever. To me, this was so incredibly unacceptable. So I set about looking for solutions. And honestly, Nigel, it was a lot of stumbling, some dead ends, but it led to a list of solutions. For instance, when I added vitamin D, up till that, I didn't add vitamin D till maybe 12 years ago, something like that. Up till then, we were lucky to see the heart scan score just stop or slow to maybe single digits, 3%, 8% per year, an occasional reduction in score. We added vitamin D. For the first time, we saw scores plummet.
Okay.
36%, 48%, 56, 64, 84%. We're talking about dramatic bona fide reversal of coronary disease. But published some of those data, but it led to this notion that, so the number one cause for heart attack, heart disease, need for stents, implant stents, bypass surgery, number one cause from a cholesterol so outdated, I hate to even say it, but if you do the real test, not this outdated, rusty, beat up old thing called cholesterol, which is it's ridiculous. You do a more advanced form of testing called advanced lipoprotein analysis, which is nothing more than looking at the particles in the blood that are presumably associated with heart disease.
This is like checking out the particle size, is that right?
And you look at particle size, specifically LDL particle size, not LDL cholesterol, but LDL particle itself. And you look at size, and the most common abnormality by a long stretch is an excess of small LDL particles. And that's consistent with the science that tells us those particles are more oxidation prone, they're much more adherent to the arterial wall, they're much more inflammation provoking, they last several days longer than large LDL particles. Well, only two groups of common foods trigger formation of small LDL particles in the body: grains and sugars, period.
Okay.
So I took grains and sugars out of my patients' diets, and this is going back some years still. And people did it, and small LDL would plummet. It would drop from something like 1,843 nanomoles per liter, it's a particle count per volume, to zero.
Wow.
In other words, not a little bit better, but virtual obliteration of that abnormality contributes to heart disease. But what really changed my life and the way I thought about things, Nigel, and led to all these crazy things I do, is people would come back to me and say, you didn't tell me I would lose 78 pounds. You didn't tell me my waist would shrink by 6 inches and I would no longer have type 2 diabetes. My acid reflux went away. My bowel urgency from irritable bowel syndrome disappeared within 5 days. The joint pain in my wrists and fingers just gone in the first week. My skin rash, seborrhea, and eczema disappeared within 3 weeks. And my depression is lifted. I no longer have the impulse to drive into oncoming traffic with suicidal thoughts.
Hooray!
Nigel, this was happening every day, numerous times every day.
Amazing.
And in combination with this, not only were people dropping those heart scan scores, when I was younger, I used to go to the cath lab and deal with heart attacks every day, morning till night. It wouldn't be uncommon to be in the cath lab from 7 in the morning till 10 at night. The need for procedures, Nigel, dropped to zero.
Wow.
People follow these. There are people who don't give a damn, right, who smoke and do bad things, but the people who actually did give a damn and did care about health, the coronary events, the need for procedure, Nigel, dropped to zero.
That's incredible. That's absolutely nailing prevention, isn't it? I mean, that's a real result.
But it's a problem in the U.S. where tons of money is made by cardiovascular disease is 50% of hospital revenues now. And so they live on this. And how do you pay for an $80 million new cardiovascular wing when heart disease is something you can deal with, for the most part, in the majority, for nothing?
Yeah.
Because the strategies that work in arresting and reversing heart disease, they're not free, but they're damn close to free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very similar to cancer approach. I was talking recently to Professor Thomas Seyfried, and he was explaining to us similarly, the similarly empowering and the lack of equipment, the lack of money needed to solve these problems. So, okay, so you were practicing cardiology, and this is you discovered that wheat and sugar were the two culprits in producing this abundance of small LDL particles, which is am I correct? That's the prime cause, would you say, or indicator of heart disease?
It's a major indicator. Inflammation is another one. Grains and sugars, of course, amplify measures like C-reactive protein and other inflammatory measures. So small LDL and inflammatory measures and some other factors all kind of work in concert to contribute to coronary atherosclerosis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, look, maybe I can provide a little bit of context here because, just for the listeners as well as yourself, is that, we have a theme on the show of addressing health issues. And it isn't because I'm a health geek. It's not because I'm a health nut. It's because of the context of today. You've already alluded to with the vast amounts of money to be made almost out of these diseased conditions when you bring in the pharmaceutical companies and all this and all the vested interests of the wheat industries, the sugar industries. So there's a huge amount of disinformation and propaganda that I think the average person can easily fall prey to unless they're wised up, unless we can inspire people to think outside the box, to question even their doctor, dare I say it, and look elsewhere for solutions outside of the mainstream, outside of what I call the matrix. So this is really about what we're all about here on the show. So we've seen how you've sort of got into this interest in wheat specifically. Um, I know from your book that one of the themes is that wheat has changed. So wheat. I know you've already said, or not, in your book you've explained how wheat is bad anyway, but you also say that it's changed and got even worse. So where's the best place to start? Should we start with the fact that wheat is not what it once was, and then come around to discussing all the actual things in it that are so harmful? Which is your preferred way to go?
Sure. Well, I think your viewers will be most surprised by the fact that modern wheat, this is essentially a true worldwide, Nigel. This is not just in Kansas or Saskatchewan. This is true all through Western Europe, Africa, Asia, as well as North America. And that is wheat. We all think of wheat, I think, as the wheat that we saw as kids, this 4.5 foot, 2 meter, almost 2 meter tall, meter and a half tall plant. But it's not. It's about it's 18 inches, so it's about, what's that, 30 centimeters, something like that, tall. It's short. Has a very thick stalk, has very thick, large seeds, long seed head, and it is biochemically and genetically very distinct. This is called the high-yield semi-dwarf strain. It was the invention in essentially the laboratory in the 60s and 70s by well-meaning people, by the way. This was not an evil plot by agribusiness. This was well-meaning scientists and well-funded research foundation efforts to increase yield per acre of grains, wheat, corn, and soy. Soy is not a grain, of course, but those are the primary focuses. And they were hugely successful, increasing the yield per acre of wheat. But they inadvertently amplified numerous negative aspects of the wheat plant. And there are other efforts, likewise, that while agricultural scientists work to increase such things as yield per acre, or resistance to fungus or mold, or a cold resistance, the agricultural type issues, they never ask, does this remain safe and appropriate for human consumption?
Right.
If there had been a requirement by the Health Service or the USDA or Health Canada for testing in humans, they would have found just how destructive they made this plant. It was a problem to start with. You could still have diabetes and autoimmune diseases from consumption of even traditional strains of wheat and grains. But what they did inadvertently is amplify the toxicity of this plant manyfold.
Okay. So that change was brought about, you said, during the 60s, end of the 60s, 70s, when wheat really became this modern form that we now consume.
It continues to evolve, Nigel. It continues to change every day. Now agribusiness people play a game with us. They play this word game. They say Davis is not right. There is no such thing as genetically modified wheat. Well, I never said there was genetically modified wheat. What they're referring to is the term genetic modification, or GMO, refers to the use of genetic engineering or gene splicing. And they're correct that no genetic modification techniques were used to insert or delete genes in modern wheat. The methods used to change wheat predate genetic modification, were much more crude and in many instances far worse than genetic modification, such as the methods of chemical mutagenesis, where a scientist exposes the wheat seed and embryo to a toxic compound, or it could be gamma rays or X-rays or other toxic exposures, and induces mutations. And they induce dozens of mutations at a time. Sometimes they're fatal to the plant. Sometimes they get the ones they want, and then they propagate that plant. Provided it continues to make good bread and rolls, they're happy. So that's how they created, by the way, what's called Clearfield wheat. It's one of the most popular forms of wheat in the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. It's patented by the BASF company, the German chemical company, world's largest chemical company. And it's very successful because it allows the farmer to spray Imazamox, another herbicide, all over his wheat, and it kills the weeds, doesn't kill the wheat. But now, of course, people who consume that wheat are exposed to this Imazamox. I called one of the scientists, by the way, at Oregon State University. This is some years ago now. I asked him, could you explain this process to me? Well, he kind of understood I was working on exposing all this. And he says to me, "Oh, but don't worry. We send most of that wheat to China."
Shocking.
Yeah.
Shocking.
The thinking of people in agribusiness and that related industries it's pretty shocking when you expose it to the light of day.
So what's the name of that stuff that is sprayed on the Clearfield wheat? It's
called Imazamox.
Imazamox, okay.
And
right.
The brand name is Beyond.
Yeah, it's like it's like glyphosate, isn't it? I've heard that glyphosate became used as a desiccant, to assist northerly farmers from timing their harvest a little bit more effectively, to actually kill the wheat and assist its drying out in the harvest process. And as a result, I believe that began around the early to mid 90s. And as a result of that, the amount of glyphosate that obviously human beings end up consuming with their breakfast cereal skyrocketed quite dramatically. So, and yet another chemical that's snuck in there to the detriment of our health.
There are components within the wheat itself. So the Imazamox, the glyphosate exposure, all those are bad things. Some of the things the baking industry has done with whitening agents and those are bad too. But just looking at the wheat plant itself, even before it has any glyphosate or Imazamox in it, there are fundamental, very substantial differences introduced into the wheat plant. So too many to go into right now, but for instance, one of the things wheat germ agglutinin, for instance, unrelated to gluten, is a protein that's toxic to many pests, rusts and molds and some insects. And so farmers or scientists, agricultural scientists, chose strains with higher wheat germ agglutinin content. Did this many times. So modern strains of wheat have much higher wheat germ agglutinin content. Well, wheat germ agglutinin is a very potent, toxic in nanogram quantities, is a very potent gastrointestinal toxin to humans.
Okay.
And the average person who consumes a diet rich in healthy whole grains gets about 20 milligrams per day. It's a very potent gastrointestinal toxin. The gliadin protein of wheat and related proteins in other grains, like the secalin in rye and the hordein in barley and the zein in corn, is degraded only partially by human digestion. And it's broken down to small pieces or peptides, and those act as opioids on the human brain. And it can do things like induce behavioral outbursts in kids with autism or paranoia in people with schizophrenia. It can induce depression, people prone to depression, or suicidal thoughts. People prone to suicidal thoughts can trigger 24-hour-a-day food obsessions in people with bulimia and binge eating disorder. In you and me, everyday people without those conditions, it only amplifies appetite such that you take in about 400 to 800 calories more per day. So it's my suspicion, Nigel, unfounded, I don't have proof of this, it's my suspicion. I almost had proof, but don't have it yet, that big food, when they recognized that agribusiness had changed the gliadin-derived opioid peptides of wheat and amplified their appetite-stimulating effect, they recognized this in the late 80s. They began to put wheat in some form in everything. You know, in the U.S., up till about 1970, you would find wheat in obvious places like pasta, rolls, baking mix, etc. In modern day U.S., you find wheat in salad dressings, licorice, granolas, all breakfast cereals, all frozen foods. You almost cannot find any food on the shelf unless it's something untouched, like a green pepper, say. It's almost impossible to find a food without wheat flour or some other wheat component in it. And I think it's put there to amplify appetite and increase caloric consumption and thereby increase sales.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite shocking, isn't it? So I think is there another effect of gliadin as well? You've spoken about the appetite stimulant effect because it's an opiate, or the breakdown peptides are opiates. Is gliadin also implicit in causing leaky gut? Does it play around with things in the gut? I believe I've heard that it's responsible for tearing apart these tight junctions and sort of exacerbating its own ill effects effectively. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Dr. Alessio Fasano, University of Maryland, now at Harvard, he published extensive work in that area, trying to understand why people got leaky gut. Well, he likened gliadin to the cholera toxin, because cholera toxin, of course, causes enormous leaky gut. People die of voluminous quantities of diarrhea. So he looked for a protein that resembled cholera toxin. He found it in gliadin, the subcomponent of gluten. And then he explored the mechanism by which this works. As you say, gliadin initiates a process that pulls apart the tight junctions, or the barriers between intestinal cells that allow many things to get through. Gliadin itself, gliadin-derived peptides, lipopolysaccharide, that's a breakdown product of bacteria that when it gets access to the bloodstream is highly inflammatory. Wheat germ agglutinin is allowed through. Numerous components. This is the first step in a growing list of autoimmune diseases. So consumption of modern wheat is an enormous risk for autoimmune diseases.
Right. So apparently also gluten sensitivity is on the rise. Celiac disease is on the rise. So you've mentioned gliadin, actually a breakdown product of gluten. Are there any specific problems from the gluten that most of us are getting as well? Would you say?
It's a long list. So it stimulates appetite. The gliadin of gluten stimulates appetite when broken down to opioid peptides. Mm-hmm. Gliadin itself is the initiating factor in a lot of autoimmune diseases, and clearly in type 1 diabetes in kids and rheumatoid arthritis. But now there are other conditions proven to be triggered by the gliadin. Gliadin triggers autoimmune brain diseases. That work comes from the UK. That's cerebellar ataxia, where the cerebellum, responsible for such things as balance, control of bladder and bowels, degenerates, and you eventually die just a few years later. Peripheral neuropathies, if they're not due to diabetes, they're almost always due to wheat consumption, the gliadin protein. The gliadin protein has been associated now with literally hundreds of health conditions. And the change introduced, gliadin's always been a problem for humans, but agribusiness amplify. And by the way, this is not my speculation. This is there are literally hundreds of papers. All I did, Nigel, was say, what the hell is going on here?
Asking the right questions.
Now, when people talk about gluten sensitivity, one of my issues with that is that so if we look at wheat as nothing more than a vehicle for gluten, we're only going to see problems with gluten. It's like seeing the only problem with tobacco and cigarettes is nicotine. Well, you and I know there's plenty of problems with tobacco beyond nicotine. There's cadmium and mercury and all kinds of there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of toxic compounds in burning tobacco and inhaling it. Likewise, with using the products of modern wheat, gluten or gliadin is only one problematic component. There's wheat germ agglutinin.
Yep.
There's phytates. Phytates are also pest resistant, and farmers have chosen strains with higher phytate content over the years. And with that, it makes it better, more pest resistant. But phytates bind nearly all the calcium, magnesium, iron, and zinc in your diet. That's
Seriously?
that's why iron deficiency is very common, and for unclear reasons among females. I've seen countless ladies who've been through bone marrow biopsies, all kinds of testing, get periodic transfusions, iron injections, oral iron supplementation, and they struggle with severe anemia. That goes away within 2 weeks of getting up all grains. That's due to the phytates.
Okay, is that also tied in with arthritis and things like that? Is that linked with that chemical?
Not phytates, but the inflammation induced by so if we looked at wheat and grains as a magnificent magnifier of inflammation via gliadin protein, gliadin-derived peptides, wheat germ agglutinin, and other factors, it does. So if you have a degenerated knee from overuse over the years, or genetic predisposition, so not a rheumatoid arthritis, but just an osteoarthritis, a run-of-the-mill kind of arthritis, doing this lifestyle will not rebuild your bone, but it will remove a lot of the superimposed inflammation and pain. So this is a very common situation. Someone says, I have a bad hip. They tell me I need a new hip prosthesis, and I was living on the anti-inflammatory drugs, and I couldn't live with the pain. I went off wheat and grains, and pain is not gone, but it's 90% less. I don't have to take those anti-inflammatories anymore, and I canceled my hip surgery.
Okay.
So it's a very common kind of a story. It just removes the superimposed inflammation. Another means by which inflammation is fueled by this lifestyle is there's another component of wheat and grains called Amylopectin A.
Right. Yes.
We're often told, of course, that the complex carbohydrates of wheat and grains are better for us. That's a complete fairy tale. Amylopectin A raises blood sugar higher, ounce for ounce, than even white table sugar.
Okay.
And so eating grains, whether it's white or whole grain, multigrain, doesn't make a difference, raises blood sugar to very high levels. Well, that provokes insulin, and that leads to a cascade of process that grows visceral fat, visceral tummy fat, inflammatory fat, and that is very inflammatory. And that likewise makes arthritis, skin rashes. It amplifies all these effects. In other words, what we have under the guise of wheat and healthy whole grains is an enormously crippling food that causes autoimmunity, inflammation, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, visceral fat accumulation, etc.
Okay, so just to recap, that's amylopectin A, is it? Is that the main carbohydrate constituent of the grains? Is that true?
It's the main carbohydrate component. Yeah, there are others.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to even admit this, but there's actually some good carbohydrates in grains. But it's the reason why we actually add back what are called prebiotic fibers in this lifestyle I advocate, because you do lose a couple, 3-4 milligrams of grams of healthy fibers when you get rid of grains, and we can compensate for that easily with other foods.
Okay. What about lectins? Are there other lectins within wheat that we need to be aware of, or that cause specific conditions?
Oh, I'm very impressed you raised that question. So the lectin of wheat is wheat germ agglutinin.
Okay, that's covered it, yeah.
Yeah, and the same lectin is in rye and barley, and oddly in rice.
So with this amylopectin A, that's obviously a massive contributor combined with the gliadin as an appetite stimulant. Obviously, the thesis of your book, Wheat Belly, is this increase in visceral fat, abdominal fat, as a result of eating wheat 3 times a day virtually. I mean, that's not uncommon, is it? Even in this country as well, for people to find themselves with wheat on the table 3 times a day, and the associated insulin blood sugar roller coaster, and I guess you've attributed a lot of that to the obesity epidemic.
Yeah, there are other factors. There's no question. Consumption of soft drinks,
Sure.
Certainly in the U.S., a big problem. Inactivity may be part of the problem, but our grandparents weren't that active either for the most part, so it's not a big factor. But a big factor is this food that all government agencies advocate, whether it's the National Health Service or the USDA or American Diabetes Association or the British Heart Association, American Heart Association. They all agree, Nigel, that your life should be filled breakfast, lunch, dinner, and all snacks
with grains.
With grains.
Yeah, what is it? Is it 11 servings? I think on the is that the current USDA food pyramid that has 11 servings of whole grains on the base of the pyramid, or is that now superseded by the food plate?
It was superseded by the food plate, but they're all as nonsensical as.
Yeah.
But it was 6 to 11. Now here's an interesting phenomenon. There are smart people in government and in industry, and they're seeing what's happening. And what do you do when all these agencies realize they got it not just a little bit wrong? If they advocated a diet, Nigel, that was just ineffective, that would be bad enough. They advocated a diet that contributed in a large way to the world epidemics of obesity, overweight, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune disease, and numerous other conditions. They actually were part of the problem. They're the cause.
Absolutely.
And so in the U.S., everyone likes to sue each other, right? What do these agencies do when they realize they screwed up in a big way? Imagine the American Lung Society said, Nigel, for lung health, they didn't say this, of course, but if they said this, for lung health, smoke a pack or two of cigarettes a day because it makes you breathe deeply. And then they find out, of course, increased lung cancer. This is what's happening now. Right. So the high plate has ratcheted back very quietly its advice from 6 to 11 servings of grains a day down to 6.
Okay.
I predict the next round they'll say 3 or 4. That's the state. American Diabetes Association, likewise, they told everyone there's no cure for type 2 diabetes, and you should have unlimited 250 to 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. They're quietly ratcheting that back as they see tidal waves of people who got rid of type 2 diabetes, even after years of American Diabetes Association. The president of the association himself has said numerous times, you cannot get rid of type 2. I was a type 2 diabetic, Nigel, 25 years ago. Not anymore. I have perfect blood sugars, perfect A1C, and I take nothing. And I've done that with thousands of people. By the way, there's more than me saying this, too. There's a lot of us saying this.
Sure.
But there's too much money to be made with this man-made disease called type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so is it just all of the vested interests, do you think, that prevent the message getting through? Because when did Wheat Belly come out? It's been out a few years now, hasn't it? The cat's out of the bag. You've illustrated all of the harmful effects. What do you find is the general reaction that you get from a lot of your colleagues? We've acknowledged the vested interests, but what about the doctors on the street and the American Heart Association? I mean, what's their view when this comes in? Again, is it the fear of litigation where they just daren't say anything?
I think there's a lot of factors at work, but what I saw happen with my colleagues is, one, they generally don't give a damn about conversations about diet. So it's not like they know what's going on. They have no idea what's going on because they're worried about the next brand of defibrillator and what the fees will be for implantation. They don't give a damn about your diet. So they just go, they say, Nigel, I don't care about diet. Go talk to the dietitian. She'll tell you what to eat. Okay.
Yep.
But what I saw happen is this. The ones who actually did comment, of course, who've never read the book, never understood the science, never read the papers, never talked to anthropologists, none of this stuff. They just said, that's stupid. Wheat Belly's going to give you a heart attack. But what happened was I saw, because, now we're in 44 countries. The book has sold 4 million copies in North America. So the message has reached a lot of people. But what I saw happen, Nigel, is people would go back to their doctor and say, hey, I did it. Even though you told me don't do it, I did it. I'm now in a size 4 dress for women. Guys say my waist size went down 8 inches. I had to stop my diabetes drugs, my blood pressure drugs, my acid reflux drugs, my irritable bowel syndrome drugs, my antidepressants. I'm off 8 drugs. I'm on none. I look better, feel better. I look 20 years younger. And the doctor has no idea what's going on. But they start to realize of the two people in the room, the doctor was the ignorant one. And people were succeeding. People were succeeding, Nigel, despite the blundering and ignorance of the doctor.
Yeah.
That's what led me down this path of undoctored, by the way.
Yeah.
It was because I realized what we really have in this new world of collaboration, like you and I are doing and sharing with your listeners, is we have the capacity to be healthy because the doctors aren't doing it, the hospital systems. This is much worse in the U.S. because healthcare is such a profit-driven industry. It's a problem in the UK as well, no question, but it's much worse here. And one of the things I didn't recognize when I wrote Undoctored was that me and like-minded authors, in the U.S., only the U.S. and New Zealand have direct-to-consumer drug ads, and Nigel, they're everywhere. Yeah. Anybody who visits the U.S. will be horrified at every other commercial is a drug ad, and it now drives $6 billion of advertising revenues in big media. Well, what that means now is big media now will no longer host any kind of author conversation news that could antagonize their pharmaceutical advertisers. So even though healthcare is an enormous disaster in the U.S. now, that's crippling families, it's costing unbelievable, it's 18% of GDP, it's $10,000 per American per year. It's crippling. You don't hear, no one knows any of the details because ABC, CBS, NBC, most print media no longer talk about healthcare. They're afraid to. They're afraid of losing advertising dollars. Right. So I'm fearful for what the American healthcare disaster is going to lead to, but it's become a bubble.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you talk about this medium and your book and all of the other social media today, essentially bypassing the mainstream, the sort of matrix message, as I would refer to it, and truth actually ends up in the hands of the ordinary people, and I think it's exciting because the change will come from the grassroots, won't it? It'll actually be people driven, speaking about these amazing results of which you've shared some. That went away, autoimmune diseases going away. And that eventually spreads, and you can't sort of put that out. Eventually, that will spread far and wide. But eradicating wheat is a phenomenally difficult thing, isn't it? You've outlined some of the problems, the things in it that cause the problems, and you've shown us how people get a lot better and lose weight, etc., when they remove wheat. But because it's in everything, it's really quite difficult to avoid, isn't it? Obviously, bread is a number one start. But do you have any advice or comment on how to attack that very difficult task of weaning ourselves off wheat?
Well, first of all, your listeners should know there's a withdrawal or a detoxification process because it's due to that gliadin protein because it yields opioid peptides. When you first stop consuming all wheat and grains, you go through about a week of nausea, headache, fatigue, and depression, and opiate withdrawal syndrome.
Yep.
But then you feel wonderful. It also means because people have worked themselves into habits and need for holidays and entertaining. So one of the things we do is I show people how to, and there are many of us doing this now. It's really kind of caught on pretty wide in a widespread way. You can make cheesecake and pizza and cookies and muffins, but we're going to use non-grain flours. We'll use things like almond flour, coconut flour, some of the legume flours, and you can make very delicious replacement foods.
Okay.
But you put your finger on an essential point, and that is we got to this place in human history with 7 billion people on this planet by following a diet that kept us alive but made us pay a very substantial price in chronic disease, now enormously amplified by the blunderings of agribusiness and my colleagues. And so we have a planet that can't sustain 7 billion people by eating this way anymore. So I don't have an answer for that. And I don't think it's going to play very well in Ethiopia, India, and Pakistan anyway. But I think it will play better in the UK, Australia, and North America, where we have the luxury to do these kinds of things. Because I think this mess will be undone over decades to centuries. It won't be undone by next year. It's going to take a long time. before the world recognizes that consumption of grains was
A bad
a,
idea.
a mistake, a very bad idea.
Again, I'm sure it will be consumer led. I mean, I don't imagine that the grain industry is just going to pack up its stall and go away. It's going to be people just buying less grains and then less grains and less grains, isn't it? What about the other grains? You know, your millet and buckwheat and spelt and all these other grains. Are they okay?
Well, I remind everybody, you and I understand that nutrition science is not science at all. It's closer to fairy tales and science fiction, because in nutrition,
You mean in the mainstream, yeah?
in the mainstream,
Yeah.
the rules of logic don't seem to be followed in nutritional thinking. So here's a very common flawed sequence of logic that's often applied in nutritional thinking. If there's something bad in diet and you replace it with something less bad, and there's an apparent benefit, a whole bunch of the less bad thing must therefore be good.
Yeah.
So the analogy I draw to make it look stupid, because it is stupid, is what if we replaced a full tar unfiltered cigarettes with low tar filtered cigarettes? And what if we could prove there's a modest drop in lung cancer and heart disease? Should we conclude by that experiment that smoking a whole bunch of filtered low tars is therefore good for you? Of course, it's stupid, but that is the logic. You'll see that applied over and over and over again. Low glycemic index foods are better for you than high glycemic. No, they're both terrible for you.
Gotcha.
So the same thing applied here. So if we replace something that's very destructive for health, the products of modern high-yield semi-dwarf wheat, with, let's say, spelt, which is more of a traditional form of wheat, or red fife, an heirloom form of wheat from Canada and North America from the 19th century, or emmer wheat, that's that wheat of the Bible, or einkorn wheat, the ancestral form of wheat that still grows wild in the Middle East. They'll be less bad, but they can still be quite harmful.
Okay.
We know
Sorry, I'm just sorry to interject, but out of interest, the all of the things like the gluten and the amylopectin A and the lectins and so forth, are they also present in your buckwheat and other things, or is it just not even worth talking about? They're all in the same bag. Just you're better off if you just remove all grains. Is that what you would say?
Well, their grains are grasses. They're seeds of grasses, and grasses are very promiscuous. They interbreed a lot. And actually, agricultural scientists use that. Modern wheat is the product of numerous crossings or matings with wild grasses. So it means that oats share a lot of characteristics with wheat. It means that millet shares some characteristics with oats, etc.
Right.
Buckwheat is not a grain. It's unrelated. Likewise, quinoa, unrelated. So some people call them pseudo grains. They're kind of like grains, but they don't really have the gliadin protein. They don't have amylopectin. They may have issues of their own, but they're not part of the seeds of grasses. They're not grasses. So the ones I'm pointing a finger at most of all are the grasses of the earth. There's nothing wrong with grasses. Ruminants eat them, and there's grass is beautiful. You can have beautiful grassy fields and fields of millet and wild einkorn wheat. They're beautiful. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with grasses. It's when Homo sapiens tries to consume grasses. And by the way, that hits at a very essential point, Nigel. One of the reasons why the seeds of grasses are so toxic to humans is because we don't have the digestive apparatus to break down
the seven stomachs of a cow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The multi-compartment stomach of a ruminant, the unique microbes they have a spiral colon, we have a linear couple of turn colon, they have a dental pad, their teeth grow continuously because that's what you need to consume the grasses of the world. Yeah. We have none of those things, but we were led to misbelieve in times of desperation, by the way, many years ago, that consuming the seeds of grasses was okay because it does provide calories. But people who first did that did not realize you'd pay the price of type 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, dementia, and other conditions years later.
Bill, do you think it's an overstatement to say that grains are not really suitable for human consumption? I mean, is that what would you go as far as to say that?
Absolutely. I have no doubt whatsoever. Now, if you were in Bangladesh or Ethiopia and you had nothing to eat, and you and your family going to starve, you should eat that whatever you can get, right?
Of
Including
course.
a loaf of bread or whatever.
Yeah.
So in times of desperation, when that's the only thing you have, you should do that because it'll keep you alive another day or so.
Sure.
But if you had the luxury like we do of
The knowledge and the choice, yeah, and all that.
Can I stop for a second?
Yes, you can. Yep.
I got a delivery guy at my door.
No worries. No, we'll come straight
Oh,
back.
he left. Never mind. He left. He left it at the door. Good. It's a green screen. Right, sorry. So I'll start again. Nigel, I have no doubt whatsoever that grains do not belong in the human diet if you had the choice. And I think those of us in the UK, in North America, Japan, Australia, do have that luxury. Now, that does open some very difficult, of course, ethical questions, but I don't think we have to solve all the world's problems today. But if you're a person with type 2 diabetes, obesity, eczema, psoriasis, depression, all the common diseases of civilization that primitive cultures have almost zero of, then I think one of the things to consider is, did agribusiness muck with your health?
Yeah.
And did you make the mistake of consuming grains?
Sure. And it's all about context, isn't it? As you rightly point out, if you're starving, of course you'd eat the loaf of bread and it's not an issue. But from the luxury of having all this information, from our ability to self-educate ourselves and think outside the box, to step out of the side of this mainstream download of information that everyone just buys into, and we can actually say, well, actually, I value my health, and it's important. So we can start to join the dots and choose to avoid grains. So it's really a powerful message. Another quick question here is when people are trying to ditch the grains, people are obviously going to say, well, can I just have grains at the weekend or once a month, or if I've ruled out all of that, can I still have that? Again, what's your response to that?
A lot of issues in there. One, people who become grain-free and then have a re-exposure, whether it's intentional or inadvertent, will get very ill. Most get very ill. They have joint pain, skin rashes, depression, diarrhea, abdominal pain. So one, it's not pleasant if you try to go back. Two, an effect I call, I ate one cookie and gained 30 pounds effect, which means some people are so susceptible, Nigel, to the opioid appetite stimulation that once they have one indulgence, they can't stop. And I saw this happen. People who successfully lost, say, 90 pounds were doing great, and then just said they're at an office party or some social gathering, and they say, I'm going to be bad. I'll be extra good tomorrow. But once they had that re-exposure, they can't stop, and they're 30 pounds heavy. Is that 4 stone?
Yeah, I forget now. Don't ask me about pounds and stone.
They're 15 kilos heavier in a month.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a slippery slope, isn't it?
Very. And the small, as you recall, the way I landed in this conversation was trying to help people with heart disease eliminate small LDL particles. Well, the small LDL particles, large LDL particles provoked by fat consumption, last about 24 hours. Small LDL particles provoked by grains and sugars last 5 to 7 days, sometimes longer. Okay. So that once a week indulgence gives you risk for heart disease via small LDL and inflammation.
Interesting.
52 weeks a year.
Gotcha. Okay. So really, and we have to remember we're kind of talking about addiction, aren't we? Opiate and all that from the Gliadin. So when dealing with something like addiction, it really just complete cold turkey is the way forward, isn't it?
Yeah, Nigel, this raises another anecdotal observation. I have no proof of this, just plenty of anecdotal observations. One of the things we're seeing is people who start by giving up wheat have a much easier time giving up smoking, alcohol, and drugs. And I've seen this happen. So I suspect there's some kind of cross reliance on these things where people will say, you know what, I gave up wheat because I wanted to lose a few pounds, but then I found myself no longer needing cigarettes and cutting way back on the booze. So I think there's a real effect there, but we haven't yet proven that formally.
Absolutely. I've experienced that myself with giving up smoking, taking up exercise, and improving my diet. There's a synergistic effect, isn't there? All three seem to come together. So, Dr. Davis, where can people learn more? Can you tell us about your website and how they can contact you, find out a bit obviously by the book Wheat Belly, but yeah, give us some contact details and how people can look further.
So the original Wheat Belly kind of tells the story of wheat and why and how this happened. There's a book called Wheat Belly Total Health that gives you the whole health program that goes even beyond the diet itself and talks about things like we mentioned in the beginning, vitamin D and fish oil and iodine replenishment and optimization of thyroid status, cultivation of bowel flora. We haven't even touched on that. There's cookbooks in Wheat Belly. There's also a Wheat Belly blog. There's over 1,000 conversations like this. And then the more recent version of all this, what I call Undoctored, the Undoctored blog, the Undoctored Inner Circle website, and the Undoctored book, where I show people, yeah, you can take these things and achieve magnificent health, but you got to talk to people like Nigel and collaborate and participate in this worldwide experiment we now have that makes the doctors unnecessary, because the dumbest one, the least informed person in the room on health is the doctor. The doctor, and I'm very clear in this, Nigel, and I think you know this, just you may be too nice to say it very often, but the doctors don't know what they're doing because they've been so brainwashed by big pharma, and especially in the U.S., the money, the incredible money of doling out procedures to people, that they've lost sight of the notion that all they should be doing is helping us become healthy. Sometimes a drug or procedure might be necessary, but most health should come by way of diet, exercise, restoration of vitamin D, avoiding toxic exposures in your life, and those kinds of simple things. But now, because the doctors that I know have all abdicated their responsibility and don't give a damn to talk to you about diet or nutritional supplementation, so it falls on us. Yeah, I came from that world, but it's Nigel, it's podcasts, it's blogs, it's books, it's documentaries. That's because big media in the U.S. has now abdicated their responsibility. So it's big pharma, big agribusiness, the healthcare industry is the Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and it's you and me who have to organize, collaborate, and all the people who listen to your podcast, so that we're all informed and realize that sexy sales representative, that doctor hand you a prescription, is not your friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for such an empowering message, Dr. Davis. Marvelous to hear. And I think this is such a key component in what people need to know to craft their own healthy diet, so they can move towards eating a diet to which the human genome is more suitably adapted. So thank you so much for your time and this a taster of this information, and I totally recommend for you listeners to pick up a copy of Wheat Belly and take a look at the wheatbellyblog.com, catch up more from Dr. William Davis and his work. So I hope you've all got some value from this, and please hit the like on the YouTube, and do visit the website www.lawfulrebel.com for more on how to empower yourself, how to familiarize yourself with more essential issues that you need to know about to ensure your own health in this context of disinformation and vested interests today. So thank you very much for listening, and I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.